The high-speed train raced confidently along the tracks, leaving behind small towns and villages, the hum of cars, the noise of the crowd at the station. All of it had been left far behind. Inside the first-class carriage, a cozy atmosphere prevailed. Plush seats, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, and the soft murmur of passengers engrossed in their books, tablets, or quiet conversations. Attendants moved through the aisle, serving drinks and light snacks, ensuring maximum comfort. In the center of the carriage, slightly leaning toward the window, sat Robert, an elegantly dressed black man with short cropped hair and a serious expression. He was reading a thick leather-bound book, occasionally jotting down notes in a notebook lying beside him. His calm and composed demeanor set him apart from the crowd, but also drew the ire of the conductor, Gerald, as he walked by. Gerald, a white man in his mid-40s with neatly trimmed mustache and polished shoes, was known for his strict adherence to rules. To him, order was paramount. Yet behind this professionalism lay a bias he rarely acknowledged even to himself. Upon spotting Robert, Gerald felt an inexplicable irritation. He couldn't help but think, what's he doing in first class? Surely he ended up here by mistake or somehow bought the ticket improperly. This is unacceptable, he muttered under his breath, stopping by Robert's seat. First class isn't for people like him. Steeling himself, Gerald leaned closer and in a polite but cold tone said, "Good afternoon, sir. May I see your ticket? There may have been a mistake." Robert looked up, a mixture of surprise and weariness in his eyes. Without a word, he took out his ticket and handed it over. Gerald scrutinized it, but instead of stepping away, he frowned and pressed further. Interesting. The ticket is indeed for first class, but how exactly did you come by it? Are you sure you purchased it legally?" The conductor's words were less of a question and more of an accusation. Robert met his gaze, not rising to the provocation. His voice was calm but firm. "The ticket was bought legitimately. The details are none of your concern." But Gerald wasn't ready to let it go. "Pardon me, sir, but I believe you may not fully understand. We have strict rules, and I am obligated to ensure everything is in order. Perhaps you're in the wrong carriage?" Robert took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but his patience was wearing thin. He replied firmly, "My seat is here. If you have further questions, I suggest you take them up with the train manager." By now, other passengers had started to notice the exchange. Some glanced curiously at the scene, while others seemed perplexed. Gerald, sensing he was losing control of the situation, reluctantly stepped back, but couldn't resist a parting remark. "Very well. But let me warn you, I'll be keeping an eye on you," he said, turning on his heel and walking away. Robert reopened his book, attempting to refocus on his reading, but the interaction left a bitter taste. Memories of other moments when he'd faced similar treatment surfaced unbidden. Each time he had proven himself worthy, yet the constant fight against prejudice was exhausting. The sunlight continued to stream through the train windows, but tension lingered in the air. Robert knew this wasn't over yet. The train sped up, cutting through endless fields and occasional small villages. The first-class carriage remained quiet, with only the hum of the engine and the muffled conversations of passengers breaking the silence. Gerald continued pacing the aisle, pretending to ensure everything was in order. But his focus was fixed on Robert. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had to set things right, even if it meant provoking further conflict. Robert, attempting to ignore the stares and whispers, continued reading his book, though the tension was palpable. He had been in situations like this before, and knew that such confrontations rarely ended without escalation. Staying calm and composed was essential. But inside, He felt the familiar frustration of being unfairly singled out. Meanwhile, Gerald, emboldened by his own sense of authority, decided to press the matter. He approached Robert again, this time raising his voice slightly to draw the attention of nearby passengers. "Sir, I must ask to see your ticket again. Perhaps I overlooked something earlier." Without lifting his head from the book, Robert replied calmly, "I have already shown you my ticket. You had ample opportunity to verify it." But Gerald wasn't deterred. "For your own sake, sir, I insist. If it turns out the ticket was obtained improperly, there could be consequences. It's my duty to ensure all passengers comply with the rules." At this point, several passengers turned their attention to the growing scene. Some exchanged curious glances, while others whispered to each other. One passenger seated across the aisle couldn't hold back and spoke up. "Leave the man alone. He already showed you his ticket. Can't you see everything is in order?" Gerald ignored the remark, doubling down on his determination. "You're violating the rules by refusing to cooperate, sir," Gerald declared, his voice now even louder. "If you do not vacate this seat voluntarily, I will have no choice but to call security." Robert closed his book, set it aside, and raised his eyes to meet Gerald's. His gaze was calm but steely, his tone steady. "You are accusing me without cause. Perhaps it is you who needs to reconsider your actions. I will not move because I have done nothing wrong." The firmness of Robert's response seemed to unsettle Gerald, but he wasn't ready to back down. Taking a step back, Gerald glanced around, noticing that the entire carriage was now watching him. The weight of their judgment only fueled his frustration. Suddenly, the train was jolted by a loud alarm, followed by an announcement over the intercom. The voice of the conductor broke through the air. "Attention, passengers. Please remain calm. We are experiencing technical difficulties. The train is losing control of its speed. I repeat, please remain calm." Panic erupted in the carriage. Passengers began to stand, looking around in confusion and alarm. Some clutched their belongings, while others tried to peer out the windows for answers. Gerald, momentarily stunned by the announcement, turned toward the nearest exit to investigate. Before he could move, Robert stood up from his seat and stepped into the aisle. "I need to get to the engine room," he said firmly. Gerald, still rattled by the announcement and unsure how to process the situation, turned to Robert with confusion and suspicion. "To the engine room? What business could you possibly have there? This is no time for games." Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out an ID card, holding it out for Gerald to see. On it were printed his name and title: Robert Martin, Chief Engineer. Gerald's eyes widened in disbelief as he read the ID. His face turned pale as he stammered, You're the engineer?" "That's correct," Robert replied with calm authority. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Without waiting for a response, Robert strode past Gerald, leaving him standing speechless in the aisle. Passengers who overheard the exchange began murmuring amongst themselves, some even applauding as the realization of Robert's importance spread. The mood in the carriage shifted from panic to hope, though tension remained high. In the engine room, Robert knew he would face a daunting task. Lives depended on his expertise, and he was determined to take control of the situation. Behind him, Gerald remained frozen in place, grappling with the shame of his actions and the gravity of his mistake. Robert moved briskly through the train, his strides confident and purposeful. Passengers turned to watch him as he passed, their murmurs growing louder. The panic from the announcement had thrown the carriage into chaos. People stood, clutching their belongings, or questioned each other frantically, trying to make sense of the situation. When Robert reached the door leading to the engine room, he was met by a security guard who looked just as shaken as everyone else. "Access is restricted," the guard said, his voice wavering as he tried to maintain authority. Robert calmly held up his ID card, the words Chief Engineer clearly visible. "I'm the one person who can fix this," Robert said firmly. "If you don't let me through, this train could be in serious trouble." The guard hesitated, glancing at the ID, and then at Robert's steady expression. Finally, he stepped aside, opening the door. "Good luck, sir," he muttered. Inside the engine room, chaos reigned. The control panel blinked with warning lights, alarms blared, and two operators frantically tried to regain control. One was shouting into a malfunctioning radio, while the other struggled to manually engage the emergency brakes, his hands trembling. Robert's presence immediately commanded attention. The operators turned toward him, their expressions a mix of relief and desperation. "Who's in charge here?" Robert asked, his voice calm but authoritative. I am," stammered one of the operators, a man in his early 30s. "But the system's gone haywire. We've lost speed control, and the brakes aren't responding. We're out of options." Robert nodded, taking in the situation. His eyes scanned the control panel, his mind working quickly. He stepped forward, motioning for the operators to move aside. "Step back and let me handle this," he instructed. "I need status updates. What's the pressure level in the brake system? Is the backup energy supply functioning?" The operators hurriedly relayed the information, their panic giving way to a semblance of order under Robert's direction. His hands moved deftly across the controls, flipping switches, resetting circuits, and issuing commands. "Check the auxiliary control panel. It might still have manual override capabilities," he said. One operator obeyed immediately, while the other monitored the fluctuating pressure levels. Robert worked quickly, bypassing the automated systems and rerouting power to critical components. His voice remained steady, his movements precise. Meanwhile, back in the first-class carriage, the atmosphere was tense. Passengers whispered anxiously, and some began to pray. Gerald stood near the aisle, his face pale and his hands trembling. He glanced repeatedly toward the door Robert had entered, his mind replaying the earlier confrontation. "Is everything going to be okay?" an elderly woman asked Gerald, clutching her handbag. Gerald hesitated, then forced himself to respond. "There's an engineer working on it," he said, his voice shaky. "We have to trust him." But inside, Gerald was racked with shame. The man he had belittled and accused was now the only person who could save them. His prejudice had blinded him to Robert's capabilities, and now he felt the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. In the engine room, Robert faced a critical decision. Despite his efforts, the automated systems refused to respond. He glanced at a secondary diagram of the train's mechanisms and quickly formulated a plan. "The brake pressure system needs to be released manually," Robert said. "We're going to have to access the valves in the technical compartment." One of the operators looked alarmed. "But those valves are outside the main cabin. With the train at full speed, it's dangerous." Robert nodded. "I know, but it's our only option." Without hesitation, Robert turned to the security guard who had followed him into the engine room. "I need you to guide me to the technical compartment," he said. "We don't have time to waste." The guard nodded, his expression determined. Together they left the engine room and made their way toward the rear of the train, navigating through rattling corridors and vibrating walls. The noise of the speeding train grew louder as they approached the technical compartment. Once there, Robert opened an access panel to reveal a complex array of pipes and valves. He quickly located the manual release mechanism and began to work, his hands steady despite the high-stakes situation. The guard stood nearby, ready to assist. "Pressure release in 3, 2, 1, Robert announced as he turned the valve. With a loud hiss, the system began to stabilize. The brake pressure equalized, and the train's speed gradually started to decrease. Back in the first-class carriage, the announcement system crackled to life. "Attention passengers! The situation is under control. The train is slowing down. Please remain calm." A collective sigh of relief swept through the carriage, followed by applause. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier exchange between Gerald and Robert now realized the truth. The man who had been unfairly targeted was the one who had saved them all. When Robert returned to the first-class carriage, the passengers erupted into cheers and applause. People rose from their seats, some offering handshakes, others simply clapping in gratitude. Robert acknowledged their thanks with a polite nod, but his expression remained humble. Gerald, standing off to the side, felt frozen in place. His face was pale, his eyes downcast. He wanted to apologize, but the weight of his actions left him speechless. The first-class carriage erupted into applause as Robert stepped back into the aisle. Passengers rose from their seats, many with tears in their eyes, clapping and cheering. Some reached out to shake his hand, while others simply voiced their gratitude. "You're a hero," exclaimed one woman, clutching her child. "Thank you for saving us." Robert nodded politely, acknowledging their thanks with humility. He raised a hand to quiet the crowd, his voice calm but authoritative. "Thank you, but I was just doing my job. The important thing is that everyone is safe. Please, stay seated until we come to a complete stop." The carriage gradually quieted, but the awe in the passengers' eyes remained. Robert's presence now radiated authority and respect, a stark contrast to the suspicion and prejudice he had faced earlier. In the corner of the carriage, Gerald stood stiffly, his face a mask of shame and regret. The applause and cheers around him felt like thunderclaps, each one a reminder of his earlier behavior. His stomach churned as he replayed his accusations against Robert, realizing the depth of his mistake. Gathering his courage, Gerald stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly. When he reached Robert, he hesitated, then spoke in a halting voice. "Sir, I owe you an apology. My behavior earlier was completely unacceptable. I made assumptions about you that I had no right to make, and for that, I'm deeply sorry." Robert turned to face him, his expression unreadable. He studied Gerald for a moment, then replied, his tone firm but measured. "Your apology is noted. But I hope this experience has taught you something important. Judging someone by their appearance or making assumptions can lead to serious mistakes, not just for you, but for others." Gerald nodded, his face red with embarrassment. "You're absolutely right," he murmured. "I'll never make that mistake again. And thank you for what you did, for all of us." Robert gave a small nod but said nothing more. He had seen men like Gerald before, and while he accepted the apology, he knew that true change would only come with time and reflection. Around them, passengers began murmuring again, some commenting on Gerald's behavior. "That's the same conductor who was giving him trouble earlier," one man whispered to his companion. "Unbelievable." "I hope he learns his lesson," another added. "That engineer saved us all." Meanwhile, the train gradually came to a full stop at the nearest station, where emergency personnel and the train manager were waiting. As passengers disembarked, many stopped to thank Robert again, their gratitude evident in their faces. The train manager approached Robert, shaking his hand firmly. "Mr. Martin, I can't thank you enough for what you've done. Your quick thinking and expertise saved countless lives today." We're all in your debt." Robert shook the manager's hand and replied modestly, "I was just doing what needed to be done. I'm glad everyone is safe." As Robert prepared to leave the train, he turned back to face the passengers one last time. His gaze lingered on Gerald, who stood silently in the background, still grappling with his shame. "Sometimes," Robert said, addressing the crowd but clearly directing his words to Gerald, "the person you underestimate the most can be the one who saves your life. Think about that the next time you're quick to judge." The carriage fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. With that, Robert stepped off the train, walking calmly into the station, his head held high. The aftermath of the incident rippled through the train company. Gerald was called into a meeting with management, where he received a formal reprimand and was sent to mandatory sensitivity training. The event became a pivotal moment in his life, forcing him to confront his biases and rethink how he treated others. As for Robert, his actions that day were quietly celebrated by those who witnessed them. He continued his work with the same professionalism and dedication, never seeking recognition but always ready to step up when needed. Among the passengers, his story became a powerful reminder of the dangers of prejudice and the value of judging people by their actions, not their appearance.